Dear friends, welcome at the University of Sofia. I'm on behalf of the rector and on my personal behalf of the director of the Cultural Center, I'm very like to meet you here. And especially, I'm especially pleasured to meet my colleague and friend, Dr. Aija Sakova from Estonia. Dr. Sakova has an impressive scholarly career. Her trajectory crossed very famous universities. She started her study at the notorious, famous university in Tartu. We envy you, Aija, because of that. Then she moved to another very famous university in Konstanz, in Germany. After that to the Classical University of Humboldt in Berlin, and then to another famous university in Vienna. This is really impressive scholarly career and trajectory, and she is focused on one specific problem and in one very inspiring area of research. She's doing her research in, let's say, the problems of remembrance, but this is a specific remembrance, the poetic remembrance. So she used literary texts in order to dig out memories and past, and she is, that means she's also a narratologist and a researcher of the poetic prose of the Estonian literature, but at the same time she is working on comparative basis, comparing Estonian novels to German and today also to Bulgarian novels. She has a lot of publications in German by in very famous publishing houses. And she has already a kind of very good scholarly record with publications, so that we can expect today a very interesting and inspiring lecture, which is in a way connected to the topic yesterday, because yesterday we are doing the same on the terrain of autobiography and memoirs, but today in another genre which is much more indirectly connected to memory, the genre of prose and novels and poetic prose. So Aija, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Много се радвам, че мога да съм тук днес заедно с вас и съжалявам, че не мога да говоря на български, толкова хубаво и трябва да говоря на английски. But maybe next time. So thank you once again, Professor Kjose, for inviting me and having me here as a guest of Cultural Center of Sofia University. And I'm very thankful to you all that you came here and to share this evening. My today's talk will be a kind of search. Can I just wait a little bit? Yeah, it's going to. That's okay, right? My today's talk is going to be a search for a new academic pathway. Well, not entirely new, but it's still something different from what I have done before. It was already said that in the last years I have been working intensively with the question of remembering and with the poetic of remembrance. Let me just show you the cover of the book, and I took it also with me, so if anyone would like to take a look, it's in German, then you're very welcome. And I also researched on the question of pain and pain caused by remembering, and how literature deals and approaches this pain. Well, this study was published last year. It's in Estonian though, but still, just to give an idea. Well, this new pathway that I would like to take focuses not so much on the past, but rather on the present. But in a way, it's still a question of remembering, and like it was stressed yesterday here, there is no present without the past. So the question is, what I'm approaching, what remains, or was bleibt in German, which is also a novel by Christa. What are these remains that we take with us from previous times? Maybe you could describe it also as a burden or some sort of a luggage. But this luggage is not something we can clearly see or describe, and we cannot give it up at the check-in counter at the airport. The luggage that we carry lives inside of us and is invisible. But I believe it reveals itself from time to time. It reveals itself in our behavior or in our attitudes or values. And I strongly believe, or more strongly I'm convinced, that this luggage reveals itself also through those who are born at the times of the collapse of the socialism, or even after that. Because there is always something that we take along from our parents, from homes, from school, from teachers, from kindergarten, because we didn't change our parents or teachers when the times changed. So the question I'm asking myself is, can I somehow describe or research on what is the mental heritage of socialism? And hopefully this talk today is a small step or small steps closer to this. I decided to approach this bigger question through three different authors, and through the question of shame. So shame is something that leads us to what we are ashamed of, obviously, and something that we do not want others to see or find out. We can also call it the shadow side, the dark side, if we want. Viivi Luik, one of the authors, has said, a truly free person is the one who takes also his or her shadow sides into account. So I have decided today to approach the question with the help of three different authors, and I'm very aware of that it's a little bit the courageous thing to do, or maybe a bold thing to do, because there's a high risk of failure. But since I try to live, if you don't risk anything, nothing will happen. So I was still there, and we'll see what will come out of it. So I will tell. I told you first some words about my research so far. So I will introduce the authors. I will say some words about Viivi Luik and Christa, and about the novels that I'm approaching. And then I give you a little overview about the similarities or differences. And then we get to the question of shame. And then we approach the question about the difficulties with working with Soviet mental heritage. It was already said that I have studied Estonian and German literature, and I consider myself a comparative scholar. And I just, as a remark, want to say that I absolutely believe in comparative studies and I love them. And I find the dialogues very fruitful. But often people think that the works that are compared to each other need to be similar, or the authors need to be similar. I don't think so. I don't think so. They still have to have some sort of a connection or a spiritual affinity in order this comparison or parallel reading to make sense. But they do not have to be very similarly writing authors. So you see the three novels that I'm going to discuss today. I also have written down the translations. So you see that Christa Wolf's novel Stadt der Engel, or The Overcoat of Dr. Freud, is also available in Bulgarian translation, published 2012. And Viivi Luik's last novel, her other novels are translated also into English and German, but this one will appear in German this autumn at the Shadow Theatre. So I will not need to tell you about Georgi Gospodinov, since you probably know a lot more about him than I do. But I would still like to tell you a little bit, tell you about the encounter, my own encounter with his work. So a year ago, when I visited Bulgaria on a vacation, I went to a bookstore with a good friend of mine, and I asked him what book could I take with me, what would he recommend me to take. I was afraid that my Bulgarian would not be sufficient for reading the book, but hence of that I still wanted to live with a book in Bulgarian in my suitcase. So the book I bought was Fizika na Tagata, and it turned out to be, of course, too difficult for me to read in Bulgarian. But since translations were available, I bought one in German, and on a trip to Berlin last summer, I started reading the book. So interestingly, on my way to meeting my colleagues from Christa Wolf Society in Berlin, I encountered also Gospodinov's work. So much about that. So here you see the covers in German and also the English cover of the book. Viivi Luik, born 1946, is one of the most known Estonian contemporary poets and novelists. She has published 3 significant novels and over more than 10 poetry books, I guess. But the novels, I don't even know that if you can read there, but I will tell them anyway. So the novels are The Seventh Spring of Peace, Seitsmes Rahukevad in Estonian, published 1985, and publishing it during the rule of Soviet censorship was some kind of a small miracle, and along with the Finnish translation that appeared actually next year. This novel tells the readers a story of the story through the eyes of a lonely 5-year-old country child, and conveyed by an adult narrator. The world of Luik's child conveys a village life during the Stalinist collective farm hysteria, and empty farms, from those who were deported into Siberia, or the world of guerrillas hiding in the forest. It's a story of life in a midst of poverty, irrational evil and fear, and contrasted to the Soviet utopias. And this novel, The Seventh Spring of Peace, has also been compared to Günter Grass' Blechtrommel, or also with Christa Wolf's Kindheitsmuster, The Patterns of Childhood. The other novel from her, which I will briefly touch on, is The Beauty of History. That's the second novel, published in 1991 during Glasnost. Basically it was published during the time when Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were separated from the Soviet Union. In this novel, Viivi Luik sets her characters against the background of history, and she uses a historical time that is used in many other novels also, the year 1968. So it's a kind of looking back, thinking things through, and a sort of also a remembrance book. But it's also a love story. The main character, the young girl, is a hippie is a young hippie from socialist Estonia. She's selfish and fearless in her ignorance. And her lover, a Jewish artist living in Riga, is thinking or is concerned with the question how to not to get involved with the Soviet army and how to leave Soviet Union, which he finally does. He leaves Soviet Union, and she, the narrator, stays or decides to stay in Soviet Estonia. So the book today, or what I read in contrast to Gospodinov's novel and Christa Wolf's novel, is called Shadow Theatre. In Shadow Theatre, and the book, the novel, which is interesting also, appeared together with how to call it, an interview book, or I would even call it a sort of poetic book. The Germans have this tradition to publish poetic Vorlesungen. So the other interview book is called I Am a Book, and they are published together in the same year and kind of also belong together. In Shadow Theatre, Luik tells a story about a lifelong journey to Rome. So the book is partly situated in Rome and partly in Berlin, and it begins with a reference to Carl Gustav Jung and his failed attempt to travel to Rome in 1949. In the same year, claims the narrator of Shadow Theatre, began also her own journey to Rome. When she was only 3 years old, she saw in an Estonian abandoned farmhouse from where the inhabitants were just deported to Siberia, a huge, expensive book in the middle of muddy footsteps and traces of blood. The book was opened at the page where the Colosseum in Rome was pictured. So the narrator takes the readers to a journey into her memories and impressions of different people in different places and at different times. The journey begins with memories and emotions from Estonia during nervous and intense days in August 1991, during the Glasnost. During her travels from Estonia, from a small country that did not exist on the world maps for the last 50 years, from 40 to 91, she feels like being on a fruitful border to the two different worlds. She often reflects on the differences of the barbaric world of savages, like she likes to call it, upper from Alps from the mountains, because she is, well, the narrator is in Rome, and from there everything upper from Alps seems to be the land of savages. Because the culture layers which she finds in Rome, in Italy, are of course a lot more thicker than, for example, in Estonia, which is probably also true compared to, when you compare Bulgaria and Estonia. It is interesting that Luik does not make a classical difference between Western and Eastern Europe, and the separation that Europe went through as a result of World War II and through Iron Curtain, but she makes this interesting separation from Southern and Northern Europe. But nevertheless, the journey of the narrator of Shadow Theatre is also a personal search for a home, for longing for a home, searching and trying to understand what it is. What is this something, or what are these small, simple things that make life worth living? So I will come to Christa Wolf now. She was a German literary critic, novelist and essayist, I would say, and she's one of the best-known writers from former East Germany. But if you talk about Christa Wolf, you also need to mention or know that she was a member of Socialist Unity Party of Germany, from SED, during 49 to 89. I have listed there that she has published several novels and short stories, also diaries, and essay collection. So maybe just to mention some of the titles of her work. Kindheitsmuster, The Patterns of Childhood, published 1976, is the story of the so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or the working through of National Socialism. Cassandra, another novel, published 83, reinterprets the Battle of Troy as a war for economic power and a shift from matriarchal to patriarchal society. Störfall, The Accident, published 87, is written on the impact of Chernobyl. Was Bleibt, What Remains, what I already mentioned, written 79 and published only in 1990. Describes the narrator's life under Stasi surveillance. Leibhaftig, In the Flesh, describes a woman struggling with life and death in the 80s in East Germany hospital while she's awaiting medicine from the West. So these are just some examples of her work. One can say when Christa Wolf's Kindheitsmuster, one of the most known novels from her, The Patterns of Childhood, when this was a story of Vergangenheitsbewältigung of National Socialism and the impacts of World War II, then the novel I'm looking today Stadt der Engel, or City of Angels, or the Overcoat of Dr. Freud, could be described as a story of working through and facing the socialist utopia, the failing of socialist utopia. Also, a moral questioning of herself within this utopia. And you see, this book is also translated into Bulgarian. So similarly to the narrator of Shadow Theater, the narrator of City of Angels is an autobiographical one. The novel begins with the narrator's arrival in the United States of America, in Los Angeles in '92, with an old, basically invalid, or with a passport of East Germany, a country that at this point does not exist anymore. The novel reflects on a time when the narrator is a guest at the Research and Culture Center in Los Angeles, while in Germany it becomes public that she was, during late 50s and in the beginning of 60s, an informal agent of Stasi. The existence of this thin but existing agent folder by state security, by Stasi, it becomes as a surprise to her, so she claims. She claims that she has forgotten the fact that Stasi agents had approached her in the end of 50s. And the novel is basically a research on the question on how she could how could have she forgotten this? This is as she puts it, an excavation of memories. Just as a remark, maybe it should be also mentioned that there are 42 folders of surveillance acts on Christa Wolf in Stasi archives. So, I have talked a little bit on Viivi Luik's Shadow Theater, a little bit on Wolf's City of Angels, and I have stressed only some aspects of the so-called plots of these novels. But in reality, the novels of Wolf and Luik do not have classical plots, and it would be quite difficult also to tell someone what is the plot of Gospodinov's The Physics of Sorrow. But if I had to explain someone shortly the story about his novel, I would say without hesitation that Gospodinov tries to figure out what is the mental burden, or maybe not necessarily a burden, but what is this virtual luggage that he's carrying or taking from socialism. Unlike Christa Wolf, Viivi Luik and Georgi Gospodinov seem to me less autobiographical. Let's say they are not so much focused on their own inner lives, but they are more tellers of stories. And Gospodinov, obviously, also, he's a collector and teller of stories, as I perceive it. But if to search for similarities, like Wolf escapes to Los Angeles, Luik travels to Rome and Berlin and also Helsinki. Gospodinov also needs to leave Bulgaria, and he travels to Berlin in order to make sense of his own sorrow, of what it is that makes him unsatisfied. But the collecting of stories of others is also part of Viivi Luik's and Christa Wolf's novels. The stories that Luik tells her readers about the different people she meets on her travels, the Balkan war refugees in Rome in the 90s, or begging girls in Rome and Berlin, or about Italian dentists or property agents, are also at the same time reflections on her own beliefs and understanding of the world. Similar to Gospodinov, Luik conveys the reader that she's only a small part of the world she's surrounded of, and her life and her stories are connected with the stories of others. I quote, "In a secret way, through my flesh and blood, I was connected to the other peoples and to the big world." The prologue of Georgi Gospodinov's The Physics of Sorrow ends with the sentence, "Us sme," in English, "we am." And I have read this acknowledgement of living in plural and being connected with different generations and people over time and space as a sign of a need to work with the past, to address one's own and the past of one's country. But this connectedness with others, with different generations, or this living in plural, is also a way not to look directly into one's own story. Maybe it's also a strategy of hiding. But in order to turn to the question of shame and where do I encounter shame within these novels, I would like to stress once again that it might have, or it is certainly, a violent move to choose these different authors and these different novels. But I do believe that they all three address the question of shame, and not, let's say, the feeling of uneasiness over the socialist past. And I do not understand shame as something, let's say, bad or shameful, but rather something productive. I read and understand it as a way to approach the dark side, the shadow side, as I told earlier. I believe that those three authors are searching for a balance between dealing with the past that hasn't even passed yet and the way they could look into the future. It is the awareness that there is no escape of writing about and facing the socialist past that I encounter in their works. One Estonian writer, Kapilarete, has said, and she did not live in socialist Estonia, she lived in Sweden during the years of occupation. She has said that Estonia is a raped country. And I quote, "Living in isolation and in the lack of trust leaves its marks on people." And also another Estonian writer, Ene Mihkelson, with whom I have worked extensively, with whose work I have been dealing with, and she lived in a socialist Estonia. She has stressed that communism needs to be acknowledged as a crime against humanity, as a totalitarian regime. She also claims that these years of communism, 50 years, have developed some sort of type of a person, some sort of homo sovieticus, she claims. And I read a quote from her that I very much like. To a large measure, what allows unconsciousness and manipulation to happen originates in the form of stereotypes from earlier times. And this is dangerous to people because it allows unconscious attitudes to continue into the future. One can say that this was the way things were, and one cannot know otherwise. When what comes before gets buried, and people do not talk about it or think it through, then what is buried can begin secretly to move around and to start manipulating people. I believe that if human beings intend to have mastery of their personal, unique lives, they must also investigate this dark chamber. Not for the sake of the principle, but for the sake of the freedom and self-respect. Professor Kiosev has, in his paper Crimes Against Everyday Life, or the Pathology of Socialism, pointed out that if we have already strategies and language to talk about totalitarianism in a sense of direct violence, torture and death, we still lack knowledge and practice to address the socialist everyday crimes. In other words, we do not know how to recognize and to talk about the impact that living in a totalitarian surveillance society had on us. Also, Georgi Gospodinov, in his scholarly work, has written on the pathology of silence. He claims in his essay, After the Silence, the non-eventfulness of Bulgaria's communism and its personal stories, that there is an exceptional culture of silence in Bulgaria's society. And this culture of silence has developed within decades. But the silence is still not broken, and the habit of keeping silent, the postponement, as he said, still lies deep inside of the people. And I quote, "Communism as a system may have disappeared from our country, but we still can't be certain that what extent our duplicitous, simulative, even schizophrenic view of the world and of ourselves has disappeared along with it." Just to point out another perspective, Epp Annus, an Estonian scholar who lives in the United States and is working there at this time, has interpreted the post-socialist countries in her study, Soviet post-colonial studies, a view from Western borderlands. She has interpreted the post-socialist countries as post-colonial, from the post-colonial perspective. And she writes, "Colonial rule, like any other kind of authoritarian rule, attempts to establish a narrative block. The peoples of the empire must perceive the existing state of affairs as unchangeable." And she reads this as a sort of cultural mummification. So I believe that these three authors, Viivi, Luik, Georgi Gospodinov and Christa Wolf, are writing against this silence in order to break the cultural mummification. And doing it through looking into one's own shame is just one possibility, breaking this cultural mummification. The dark chamber that Georgi Gospodinov is looking into in his novel is the chamber of the abandoned child. The child who is a minotaur, a creature from Greek mythology with the head of a bull and the body of a human. He marks that it is absolutely striking that there are no children in Greek mythology. But, just as in antiquity, the children of socialism were also invisible, he says. I quote, toys turned out to be exactly like us from the late 70s. A child sent deep into the countryside to be looked after by his grandmother Kaia and kept far from his father. To drink goat's milk, his goat was divine of course, and to grow up hale and hearty. And another quote, it is clear that time always devours, swallows his children. But there is time where there is light, where there is lightness and darkness, day and night alternate. So it turns out that the only place hidden from time is the absolute darkness of the cave. That's where the child souls were hidden away. It was the only place where Chronos, time, did not rule. And Gospodinov asks in his novel, is there a Minotaur syndrome? The 70s, our mothers were young, studying, first, second, third year, working first, second, third shift. We were there in empty apartments, ground floors, basements, lost in boredom and fear, roaming with the vague anxieties of the one left on his own. Is there a Minotaur syndrome? I do not believe that this question, whether there is a Minotaur syndrome, is important so much because of to give a diagnosis, but I believe it's rather important in order to understand how the child Minotaur becomes a sort of monster or becomes who he is and how he is perceived. Gospodinov writes that only later the myth will transform the child into the monster. So to conclude, Gospodinov is looking in his novel for reasons for the sorrow, the inability to be satisfied. And when he looks into this chamber of sorrow, he finds the abandoned child. The dark chamber, Viivi Luik is looking into her novel, is a little bit more difficult to facilitate. She constantly returns to the question of shame, as well as in the novel Shadow Theatre, but also in the complementary poetic book, I Am a Book. And she says, you need to write about what you are the most ashamed of. And I quote, once I was asked what I'm ashamed of. First, I told that I'm ashamed of my helplessness and mortality. The helplessness and mortality of all people. Today I realize that this was a very superficial and incorrect answer. It would be more precise to say that I'm ashamed of my shame of mortality and weakness. Because the shame of weakness is nothing more than imperiousness. I'm ashamed of my imperiousness and thus the imperiousness of all people. The opposite of imperiousness is humbleness or humility. I guess the death and the feeling of heartbrokenness are the best teachers of humbleness. I believe that the shame Viivi Luik approaches and conveys is a sort of longing for belonging, or longing to belong into a culture of Western Europe, to be part of those old and multi-layered cultures that she encounters on her travels and stays abroad. But it means also some kind of a feeling of a shame of being from this small country up north, the country of savages, as she repeatedly says. This being from a country of savages might, of course, be understood as a view from Alps. It could be also viewed as an ironic saying, but I do believe that it's more than just that. It is a sort of mixture of shame and also being proud from being from this only 100 years old country. Christa Wolf's dark chamber lies in the fact that she had forgotten about the contact with the Stasi agents, Stasi officers in the end of the 50s. In Los Angeles, during the long nights full of anxiety and self-incrimination, she tries to understand how is it possible that she, the one working with memory and the question of remembering for years, could have forgotten something like this. In my memory, which I had struggled, I quote now, in my memory, which I had struggled to bring to surface, there were two young men who dropped by your office one day, at the newspaper where you worked, and they wanted some inconsequential information from you about your job. In the files, it says that they intercepted you on the street. I don't remember that. They told you that they were, but they told you what they were, personnel of the Ministry of State Security, the Stasi. So, Christa Wolf's City of Angels is a sort of moral investigation. It is a questioning of her own moral integrity, because Christa Wolf, as a writer, becomes also part of the so-called Literaturstreit, or the literature dispute in Germany that takes place in the beginning of 90s, where basically all literature coming from the former East Germany is questioned, or the morality of these literary works is questioned, and Christa Wolf is taken as an example because becoming public of those agent folders of hers. So, in order to conclude, I hope that these small remarks could convey you, or that it is necessary to address this luggage, this mental luggage, or mental heritage that we are taking from socialism. And I do believe that that shame is one fruitful category addressing this question. And also that I didn't so much stress on it today, but I believe that literature is a good way to address the question of mental heritage, because literature has these certain poetic techniques or ways of writing that makes it easier also for people to address their own shames or their own dark chapters. So just to underline it once again, one poetic strategy that we can encounter in the works of these authors is the plurality, or the living in plural. It is, as I said, in a way also a strategy for hiding, a strategy telling other stories in order not to tell or look into one's own story. But it also helps the readers to feel incorporated, to feel involved into the stories. And this technique or poetic way of writing, of escaping one's own country, is also what we encounter in all these three novels. It is traveling away, it's escaping from one's own country and one's own past in order to look on this past from a distance. I would say I will finish here, because I have been talking pretty much an hour now, and I will thank you, and I will open the floor for, or you will open the floor for. Thank you.
So you heard a very productive comparison between three very different authors, but they share this problem of perspective toward the socialist past and the narratologic coping with this past, which is very difficult and maybe very different in the three authors. I do believe that Aija is in the beginning of her research, and the comparison has specific methodological difficulties in itself. I hope that we'll discuss them. Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. The floor is open and it's yours.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Thank you very much for the lecture. I'd like to start with a question precisely about the techniques, the literary techniques used in the three novels, because to me to say it's that these works are written in a poetic way is not enough. So what kind of specific narratological strategies or figurative strategies were deployed? So this is my first question. What are the specifically literary techniques to deal with this problem? Now the second question concerns the problem itself, the problem of shame, because I'm not sure if the shame is, we're talking about shame in the same sense in these three works, and I was also wondering whether you would say that this is just a personal shame, or it's like more a collective shame, or where are the boundaries between the personal and the collective? And I don't know, I think I'd like to hear more about that. This is my second question. And one third question. Now you said it in Luik's novel. In the beginning there is a reference to Carl Gustav Jung, and then we have Freud in the title of Christa Hall's novel, and of course Georgi Gospodinov's novel tries to build up an alternative to the Oedipus complex. So in a way, I was expecting you to get to the point where you put in question psychoanalysis. You didn't, so would you say something about that?
Please collect your questions and you answer at the end. Now that the floor is still open, the discussion is going on, please go ahead. Will you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Adam Balázs from the Political Science Department. It's really fascinating, I think, to study history, memory, remembrance, forgetting, politics, society in and through literature. So thank you very much for this transition between stories and history, but hence my first question, which I think is related to the previous ones. How do you bridge the gap between stories and history? Or to put it differently, between expression in literature and communication. For I suppose that you agree that in a novel like Was Bleibt, while it's not simply an account, it couldn't be reduced to the communication of information about the functioning of the East German secret police. It's a bit more. So how do you manage, actually? I would like to have your advice on this. And my second question concerns shame, and more generally speaking, this kind of mental predicaments. And you mentioned it at the end, that sometimes stories help to dissimulate what really happened. And you went into the positive direction, saying that the distance is good, critically speaking, to see what happened. But also prose and other genres of expression might precisely dissimulate what happened, especially when it comes to shame or loss. For instance, in the case of intellectuals who emigrated and who wrote in order not to face actually what really happened. So here we found ourselves in the very contrary situation, where it's absolutely not about communicating information, but hiding it away. So have you met this kind of texts in the authors you work on? This would be my second question.
Thank you. Another questions or comments?
Thank you. I like very much the approach of this paper that has been presented today, and unfortunately I don't know the other authors, so I could say a couple of things of the author that you've mentioned already that maybe we know a little bit too much compared to you, Gospodinov's novel. And this is very much like a kind of maybe warning or giving a different approach with regard to his way of treating these questions that you've raised. Because from my perspective, what you've called a kind of association between his literary experience and you called it his scholarly. I'm not sure that this is I mean, maybe you overtreat a little bit. This is an essay, and it's very, but there is a difference between these two approaches, this kind of essayistic and literary approach. And what I think is generally accepted from the readership here is that this is exactly not the question of shame that has been treated in this novel. This is very much, if there is a shame, it is a shame of our fathers and mothers, so to speak, in order because they locked us in the maze, and otherwise it is rather, if we consider this approach of putting shame here into the equation, we should address the other aspect, and this is of course the nostalgic aspect towards communism and everything. So I would say that Gospodinov, the very kind of general perception is that he's a little bit, he's overdoing his nostalgic approach with regard to communism, and rather than the shame, the aspect of shame, which is problematic in his case, and this is the reason he was actually criticized by Alexander Kleosov, including and other critics. But also another thing that I have the feeling that somehow put Gospodinov, create some difficulties to put Gospodinov in the company of the other two authors. It has to do with a kind of, again, different approach with regard to the country of origin. There is no pride there, but definitely through the strategies of nostalgia, he's trying to overcome exactly this easy shame of the other authors for being born in undecent countries of cultural or civilizational shame, and from that, I don't think it creates actually the difficulties. Only that the basic problem, the problem that maybe shame could be treated in a different way in those three novels, would create some richness and chances somehow to see the situation in a more productive way.
Now it's turn of the moderator. I will address practically the same questions. I will start with the shame, the concept of shame, which is really problematic here. Maybe first we should elaborate a little bit theoretically on the concept of shame itself. Because in the everyday usages, shame is a moral category. But let's say there are a lot of other approaches toward the concept of shame, anthropological, psychoanalytical, and so on. Especially interesting is the psychoanalytical one. And maybe you know the important book of Leon Dürmser. I read it in German. The Shades of Shame. I don't remember the title right now, but I'll have the book and I'll show you. So these deep dimensions of shame, which are connected with the unconsciousness and with the traumas, are very interesting. And the dialectics between hiding and revealing in shame is very specific. And what is more important is to elaborate the concept of shame on the level of narratology. How the writing is expression of shame or mask of shame. The book of Leon Dürmser is called Die Masken der Scham, the mask of shame. So, and this dialectic between hiding and revealing is very, very revealing itself. So it could be very used as a kind of heuristic instrument of analysis. But you should differentiate the everyday concept of moral shame from the psychoanalytic concept of deep shame, from the narratological concept of shame as a strategy of narration, or maybe as a theme in the novel itself. Because what is on the level of theme in the novel is not necessarily the same as the everyday concept of moral shame. I'm coming to my next point, and what I like best in this lecture is the way the three authors are connected. They're connected via the motive of traveling. And the traveling itself is traveling in space, and at the same time is psychic traveling in memory and in time. So this ambivalence of the motive of traveling is used very skillfully, thank you Aija, and I believe that it should be elaborated further in order to connect the very different novels and very different authors in a way which is methodologically, let's say, unapproachable, unreproachable. And here, the traveling itself maybe demonstrates the same ambivalence as shame. Because traveling can be a kind of escaping and hiding, and traveling can be also, could be an instrument of revealing. And this ambivalence should be demonstrated on the text by close reading. The very first question or advice of Andrin Tanev is very important. How functions that on the level of the text? Not on the level of the theme of the text, but at the level of the text structures. So, further, Dimitar Kimburov said already that maybe not only close reading is the only way. Close reading is not enough. The context of the three different countries is very different, and you should place the three novels in cultural context in order to know what is they are replicas to certain things in the societies, and they are different replicas to different societies. We should know more about this cultural and historical context of Christa, of Georgi Gospodinov, and of Viivi Luik. Is that the right pronunciation? So, here another very interesting problem occurs. Christa Wolf has been born in 1929. Viivi Luik is born in 1942, right? 46. And Georgi Gospodinov is born in 1968. That means they are from three different generations, at least three different generations, if not no more. The generational distance is even more. But that means that the biographical perspective towards socialism is very different. Christa Wolf has lived all her life during the ages of communism and socialism. Practically, the most important years of her life were during socialism, and the same is to a certain extent true to the Estonian author. It is not true for Georgi Gospodinov. Georgi Gospodinov has been a child during socialism. He was in the age of 12 or 14. He was adolescent young man in the late years of socialism. And that explains to a certain extent the Bulgarian critiques towards Georgi Gospodinov connected with nostalgia. Because her perspective to the years of socialism are not connected necessarily with terror, they're not connected necessarily with suffering, with fear, with chasing and so on. They're connected with childhood experiences. Actually, before writing The Physics of Sorrow, Georgi Gospodinov published together with Jana Genova another book called Inventory Book of Communism. It's a kind of comic lifestyle book of, let's say, the material world of communism. Then he published this book of interviews and memories collection called I Lived Socialism. In the book I Lived Socialism, because it has been the memories has been selected via internet, via emails and other internet techniques. And practically all the authors in the collection called I Lived Socialism are of authors under the age of 30 at that time. That means all of them, or 35 let's say, all of them, all the authors, all the contributors to this volume are practically in the same position as Georgi Gospodinov himself. They were children during the socialism. They were at the most they were in their adolescence years, and this creates a kind of infantile perspective towards socialism. And the infantile perspective is maybe connected with nostalgia, maybe not, but it is very different from the let's say perspective of elderly man and experience different things. Actually, I personally criticized Georgi Gospodinov in a conversation with the art critic Kirill Vasilyev in connection to another initiative of Georgi Gospodinov, which was not literary, but in the area of visual arts. He was curator, together with Georgi Luzanov, on an exhibition called The Afternoon of One Ideology. It is a clear quotation and transformation of the famous poem of Stéphane Mallarmé, The Afternoon of One Thought. Mm-hmm. And in this exhibition was works by Bulgarian painters from the 80s, mostly from the 80s, selected by Georgi Gospodinov and Georgi Luzanov themselves. And it was a very specific selection. It created a very nice picture of socialism, and we were in direct conflict on that. We criticized him very severely, and he was very angry, and we had a kind of conflict because of that. That means that Georgi Gospodinov has a different biographical perspective towards socialism. How this different biographical perspective is transformed into narrative perspective. And what are the differences in the transformation of the biographical perspective of Christa, the biographical perspective of Viivi, Luik, and the biographical perspective of Georgi Gospodinov. You mentioned already that this is in a way overcome by the strategy asam всички, asam ние. That means this pluralization of the narrative perspective. At the same time, you said very clearly and rightly that this could be also a strategy of hiding, not revealing. So I don't believe that literature has no connection with biographies. But this connection is indirect, and this connection should be studied. This connection, the transformation of biographical perspective into novel perspective is a literary problem. It's not clear. And maybe this should be one of the most interesting points of your future research. This is a kind of advice from my side. Another comments, questions, and whatever.
Enjoyed your...
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, of course. I'm Mahsan Murai. I study at a PhD level here at Sofia University, Comparative Studies, Literature, North America and Iran. The subject of your talk was very interesting for me, even though I'm very distant from the literature of these regions. What I was wondering was that first of all, are these considered as historical fiction? I'm not sure about that. And if they are historical fiction, do you think that the theories of Linda Hutchins' historiographical metafiction could be applied to furthermore assist your theories and advance it and prove it even better? And if they are also historical fiction, are you treating them like someone would treat oral history, as in asking questions from the text and trying to receive answers that are maybe hidden through the subconscious of the writer, the maybe narrators, the protagonist, and even the reader, as a person who could be the receiving end of this work of art? I hope my questions don't seem ignorant. I'm still a student, and thank you very much.
So maybe we will make a stop for a while and give the opportunity to Aija for respond and to answer these questions, because otherwise she's going to forget. And after that, if there are new questions, there will be another round.
So thank you. This very fruitful feedback and critique for further investigations. So I'm figuring where I should start, and I think I will start with the question of how or what happens when biographies or biographical perspective is transformed into a literary perspective. So I'm very aware of that, literature, and even if it is autobiographical, it always has its own strategies.
We are not reducing literature to biographies, but there is a connection.
There's a connection, yes, of course, and all those authors, 3 authors, are very different, and if I have been dealing with the question of how autobiographical Christa Wolf is writing, or what is true, or what isn't, then I haven't been able to do this, of course, with Georgi Gospodinov's work. I'm not so familiar with the cultural context yet, obviously, and. For me, it is always much more interesting to look at the texts themselves, and in a way to take also the literary text seriously. So in a sense, what I mean is that we were talking with you about the question of truth, and the question of truthfulness, and what I believe is important, or I don't believe that literature has to somehow convey factual information. So this is not the task of literature. So basically, the question was also how I bridge the gap between history and literature, is in a way to say that literature cannot really give answers about historical events themselves, but what it can do, or what is interesting for me, and what I have been working in this last book, is a concept of moral witnessing, which is actually a concept coming from Holocaust studies, from oral story or oral autobiographical studies. Why this is very far from, or it seems very far from here, from the topic that we're discussing today. But what the concept of moral witnessing is telling us is that those so-called testimonies, let's say also literary testimonies, are telling us or can tell us more about what happens with the person through in certain times. So when I now put this knowledge or compare this with the novels that I was talking to, then I can do it can be applied to to the poetic strategies of Christa Wolf, who on the structure of a novel is having multiple layers in time. There are also meta-reflective layers where she reflects on what, where she reflects on her work of remembering. So Gospodinov is doing something different. And this is the right critique that you should also, or I should question maybe question the strategies, his poetic strategies, or haven't, maybe I haven't thought about it, or I have taken him too seriously, maybe then, or haven't worked on this question what he's how he is playing with the reader, or how he what is he hiding and making the reader to believe. Okay, the shame. You asked about individual, collective shame, and you pointed out that shame should be viewed on different levels, that it's an everyday notion and narratological category, and it also may be the theme of the text. So what these comments are telling me, or is that that I haven't that there needs to be one needs to be more precise about it, about the question what is concretely looked into in different texts. And maybe I also, maybe this is also a not so precise notion, because I believe that what's interesting for me is to look how, or whether literature can give a better insight into that, what whether literature can give a better insight into what we are taking from like unconscious ways of behavior, unconscious ways of our values, and I was kind of going on a search on these texts to find whether those three literary works can help me with these questions, and I admit that a lot more work needs to be done on the question there.
There are also other questions, maybe you should go to them.
You stressed also on the question of different generations and cultural contexts. Yeah, this is the main critique that's always pointed out when you are dealing with comparative studies, is that whether the compared authors or the authors that I read parallel, whether they should be from the same generation.
You can compare authors from different generations, but you should remember that they're from different generations. Of course, that's possible, but this distance is quite part of the job.
So yeah, so I understand it's you wouldn't recommend this this task, but I do believe, and I was also when I started my last study, I was also told that oh, it's probably not so a good idea to read authors from different cultural contexts, and it cannot work out. But and I do agree. You need to be very aware of that, the differences. But I want to believe that it's still possible. You asked me about whether I treat those novels as, or whether they are historical fiction. And I believe that Christa Wolf's novel is certainly a historical fiction, but I cannot, or I cannot really answer the question on Gospodinov and Viivi Luik. I would have to think on the category more precisely. And I often actually do believe that the categories are necessary, but not always fruitful. I believe that one should try first look into the text, into the close reading, work with close reading, and see what questions arise from there, and then find the categories that suit, maybe.
If you like to have a rest for a while, and because I've seen another question or a comment by Dimitar Kiburov.
Yeah, I just wanted to a little bit to elaborate on what I've said. Just to make it a little bit clearer, because I'm not sure that I made it the first time. Your approach is very much to discuss the question of this burden or luggage, as you call it. So burden or luggage gives this idea of the very difficulty to find the right way to call what it is. What's this that we have as a memory or as something that was not worked out? And after that, a kind of you make this second step a little bit too fast to give the name and to call it shame. And this is exactly what literature actually is a little bit reluctant to do in many cases at least. And this is something that, particularly in the case of Gospodinov, he very much plays with this. There is shame, but there are much more important from his perspective things having to do with this nostalgic and kind of the idea also of the contemporary moment is very important with him, the way we live out the moment now and so on. And also, I agree with Alexander Joseph that this was very good. This is a kind of central approach of central point in your approach, this traveling issue. But again, in Gospodinov's novel,
quite connectable with the topic of luggage.
yes, she actually played with this very well. But the point is that in Gospodinov, this travel does nothing good, actually. He never solves any issue. Actually, his traveling brings him back into the country of the origin, absolutely devastated. If you remember, he was broken in this foreign country and returned to his home country in order to write the novel. That was very much the story there. So this traveling has nothing to do with these other two, or not, maybe not nothing, but very different things to do. And from what you've said about the two female authors, I kind of got the impression that they speak to each other very well, and somehow Gospodinov is a little bit out of picture here in this. That was my perception. I would actually suggest two other authors that I very much believe that will work very well here in your picture. One is another Bulgarian author who was also a kind of Stasi writer. I mean, a writer who was associated with the party and also kind of, what was the term? Yeah, she was reviewed as an agent, Vera Mutavcheva. And she has all those things that you've said about the Estonian writer. This north-south, the idea of west-east as something that could be seen through the metaphor of north-south. Those things are there, and also these civilizational issues that you've addressed there. And the other author that is very important and has a lot to do with Christa Wolf here, and particularly with one novel, this is Dubravka Ugrešić, with her, the Museum of what was this?
The Croatian author, Dubravka Ugrešić.
Sorry?
The Croatian author.
Yes, the Croatian author, Dubravka Ugrešić. The Museum of Unconditional Surrender is the novel that I strongly suggest in this respect. Thank you.
So, please.
Okay. Just a comment.
But we are recording that. Because of that, please take the microphone.
Sorry. Okay, so just a comment. It's certainly hard, I think, to do comparative literature with an audience that knows a lot about one of the three writers and less about the two other ones. So it's courageous to do that, I think. And concerning just a comment concerning the distinction between biography and literature, there has been a very trendy and fancy thing lately which is called self-narration. So this is very trendy, everyone has a book in themselves and everyone is writing about themselves. This is not really a very lucky phenomenon, I guess, so it's not what you're talking about, but this is somewhere at the crossroads between precisely the relevance of a biography and the quality of literature. It was just a comment, self-narration.
Yes. Yes, thank you. I was a part of a research, actually, for 2 periods, for 3-year periods in Estonia, where especially the autobiographical narrative was like the central theme. So I have like enough of it, so maybe this is why I don't want to address it so much, but I understand. I kind of turned away from doing research on this autobiographical narration and said, of course, it is important, the questions of the truthfulness, but it does not really interest me whether, this is a little bit not a nice thing to say, that it does not interest me whether it's the truth or whether it really was the way the writer writes it. But it is not the central question, I think, that literary scholars should, or in my opinion, or it does not interest me to deal with this specific question. And yes, I do see that you are quite critical towards Gospodinov's work, and probably my approach is a little bit from far away, from a distant perspective. So I cannot sense those things that you are sensing, probably. And it could be a bad thing, because I cannot see what is there, but another way.
But that is visible even for readers outside the Bulgarian context, because Georgi Gospodinov in The Physics of Sorrow creates a kind of central meta-perspective, and that is a perspective, the Minotaur, the abandoned child. And this is the childhood's perspective par excellence we are talking about. And it is the central focal perspective of the central focality in the narration itself. It's not outside the narrative, it's inside the narrative. And I wonder whether such childish perspective of narration is available in Christa Wolf and in Viivi Luik.
Not on those novels, but in other novels it is. Yeah. So maybe it would be even more fruitful or interesting, even if one wants to look into this perspective of a child, to look at different novels from these authors.
And this perspective of the child, this is very specific and strange interplay with the mythological perspective, which is also in Christa Wolf. So there are certain possibility for a very heuristic comparison. I do believe in that.
And thank you very much for both of you pointing out or underlining the question of traveling, and that might be a very central way of approaching the text, actually. Reading through this travel metaphor, yeah.
It's really good. Maybe one last remark from my side. Of course, literature has no true claim. It's not history, it's not documentary prose, it's not autobiography, it's not whatever evidence. But according to Aristotle, it is written following the rule of probability and necessity. So that it has a true claim from a different point of view, especially the realistic prose. The realistic prose speaking about certain time. And this, let's say, generalized truth, this true claim, which is specifically literary, is compatible and comparable, capable for comparison with other kind of truths. And this is the very specific, let's say, problem of our time. How to, of course, for a long period of time, literary scholars used to research the poetic structures only and nothing more. But these poetic structures, they have political potential, they have historical potential, they are connected with the cultural context in one way or another. Only the fantastic literature is maybe free from that, but not totally, not entirely. And even the fantastic literature has certain, let's say, correspondences to its own time, to its own context, and so on. But unlike other evidences, literature can transcend time, can transcend context, which is also a very interesting thing, because it creates truth following the rule of probability and necessity. It can transcend the local context. And this dialectic should be part of the research. But you're absolutely right. If she was in Germany, they will attack her because of Christa Wolf.
No, I'm very grateful for the comments and for the critique, because this is what can get you further.
I do believe that was not a critique, it was a help for future research. Yeah, so it was. And at the end we can say, if you don't have any other remark by yourself, thank you, Aija. And thanks to the very small but very active audience.
Thank you, thank you.